last book review video, I was so excited to tell you about how much I loved David Nutt's book about alcohol. Like seriously, Drink is one of the best books I've ever read in my life. And I loved it so much I literally couldn't put it down, and everything was there: biology, psychology, anecdotes, sociology. I just couldn't get enough. So it makes sense that when I finished it, I was ready to start reading the next book in the series. And I mean, technically it's not a series, but it makes sense to read alcohol, cannabis, and then psychedelics in this order. And don't ask me why, it's just a feeling. I was really excited for this book with a ridiculously long title: Cannabis, Seeing Through the Smoke, The New Science of Cannabis and Your Health. And I wanted to have the same joyful experience I had from reading Drink. And I had really high hopes. But did Cannabis live up to my expectations? Well, unfortunately it did not. Let's find out why. First, let's quickly go through the synopsis of this book, and then we can dive into my review. But if you, for whatever reason, want to skip the synopsis, my review starts at this timestamp. The book explores cannabis from 4 different perspectives: its history, its mechanisms, medical cannabis, and minimizing harms. And this book has one goal, and that is to provide an evidence-based understanding of what cannabis does to you and what are its effects on your health. The book is divided into 4 sections and 16 chapters. The first section is called The Cannabis Story, and this section covers the history of cannabis, addressing questions like: why is cannabis so controversial? Why was cannabis banned? Cannabis and the political machine. And cannabis and harm, evidence versus politics. Section 2 explores how cannabis works. The book explains the science behind cannabis, including questions like: what is in cannabis? Welcome to your endocannabinoid system, and what happens when you take cannabis? The third section describes cannabis as medicine, and this section explores the medicinal use of cannabis with chapters like: how medical cannabis can become legal, can I get medical cannabis, the pros and cons of medical cannabis, and will cannabis work for me? And finally, the fourth section is about minimizing harms, and this section discusses harm reduction, covering topics such as: will I become dependent? What are the real harms of cannabis? Prohibition and the rise of spice? Testing, driving, and accidents? And what is the best cannabis policy? The book promises a lot and positions itself as a comprehensive guide to cannabis, much like the previous book about alcohol. So what went wrong? So okay, let's analyze the book section by section. The introduction is fine. Again, you read about the author and why his experience is even relevant. Which it is. Like, David Nutt is a neuropsychopharmacologist with years of experience in researching drugs and the way they interact with human bodies and psyche. He also had a political career, and he was famously sacked from the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs for what some people call controversial opinions, and he founded Drug Science, a non-profit organization that educates people about drug-related topics. So yeah, his credentials are solid. And to be fair, in the intro he actually says that you might not be interested in all parts of the book, and it's okay to read whatever interests you. But I wanted to read the whole book I bought, if you know what I mean. So section 1, The Cannabis Story. This section covers the history of cannabis, where it came from, and why it was banned. And in this section you can also read about David Nutt's life, the time he worked as a government advisor, and the policies he pushed for. And the history part was okay, I guess, not too exciting, but also not too long. And the chapter about David's political career was actually interesting, and it describes what drugs are illegal and why there's this huge disconnect between what drugs are legal and what drugs are harmful. And how this has nothing to do with evidence-based assessment of risks, and it's mostly up to politicians with their own agendas. Depressing, but unfortunately true. In section 1 you can also read about a study that compares drugs based on their actual harms. And I actually made a video about that, so if you're interested, you can watch it later. But basically it all feeds to the same issue, and that is, harm isn't the problem, it's politics. This section was okay, but as I said, I wasn't too excited, and I was actually looking forward to the next section. And in the beginning, like, the political stuff was okay, fun-ish I'd even say, but then there's a lot of drug A is in Schedule B, but it should be in C, and drug D is in Schedule A, but should be in F. And I know that this information is important, but it was just so dry. For me, it did read like a textbook. So I was really excited to finish this section and move to the next one. Section 2 is all about how cannabis works. So the biology, what is cannabis made of, how it works, and the way it affects your body and your mind and your brain. So we kind of go through the many chemicals that can be found in cannabis, the forms you can get cannabis in, and the differences. And this section was okay, I guess, but once again, it did read a bit like a textbook. The highlight of this section was definitely the chapter about your internal endocannabinoid system, which was really interesting, and I feel like I learned a lot. The next chapter, what happens when you take cannabis, was okay, I guess, but I wish it were more connected to the biology and neurotransmitters in a similar fashion that the book about drinking was. And unfortunately, I didn't find it here. And then the third section talks about using cannabis as medicine. And I do support medicinal cannabis, and I think using cannabis as medicine can have great benefits, and we should study it, and it's great that policies are changing for the better. But wow, this section was just endless. And even though I enjoyed reading some of the case studies that were used in this section, it was also frustrating to read about the hoops these sick people have to jump through to get their medicine, just because someone decided that banning cannabis actually suits their political agenda. The pros and cons of cannabis as medicine summarizes, the pros and cons of cannabis as medicine. This chapter is followed by another chapter that is trying to answer the question, will cannabis work for me? And this is basically just a really, really, really long list of various diagnoses and whether there is or there isn't evidence that medical cannabis can help you with that problem. And it's a good starting point, but if you want to know more about a specific condition, you need to read about it elsewhere. But as I said, it's a good starting point. And finally, section 4 is all about minimizing harms. So chapter 12 tries to answer the age-old question, will I become dependent? And I know there's quite a lot of people who say that you cannot be addicted to weed, but that's simply not true. Weed causes adaptive changes in your body, and prolonged use can lead to behavioral changes as well. And for many people, quitting weed just isn't that simple. And I'd say this chapter is once again written pretty well. Now chapter 13 explores the real harms of cannabis, and once again it dives into politics and history, and it also explores some things that are inevitable when you're alive, such as accidents, suicides, poisoning, heart issues, pregnancy, and mental health issues. Chapter 14 is all about spice. You know, the synthetic cannabinoids that are inherently way more harmful than weed. And I found this chapter pretty damn interesting, and I'd like to read more about synthetic cannabinoids. But unfortunately, as I said, I don't think this section was diving deep enough into this topic. The highlight of chapter 15 about testing driving and accidents is probably the comparison between drunk driving and high driving, neither of which are recommended, by the way. Just drive sober. And the final chapter is trying to come up with the best cannabis policy. And I think David Nutt's approach to drug policies is very reasonable and in accordance with what a lot of people who specialize in addiction treatment and prevention stand for. And once again, this book is not preachy at all and is trying to help you understand any questions you might have about cannabis. Now, reading this book made me angry. And I find this whole illegality of cannabis shebang pretty frustrating. And we have a lot of evidence that weed is not as harmful as other pretty legal drugs as alcohol and tobacco, and we have a lot of evidence that medical cannabis can significantly improve people's lives. And it frustrates me so bad that politicians actually disregard this evidence and innocent people are still prosecuted for self-medicating when they were given no other option. And I'm pretty sure we all heard the stories, about some old grandma who grew a plant to make some ailment for her joints, and then she got into some legal trouble. Or stories about a young dude who went to jail for carrying a small amount of cannabis, which could potentially ruin his future. The jail time could hurt his future, the weed probably not so much. Now, one of the strong points of this book is that it's so up-to-date. It's so recent that it actually mentions the pandemic, so you really get new information. What I consider one of its biggest weak points is that, for me, it just doesn't go deep enough. Like, the information that you get is fine, but it's kind of surface level, and if you want to know more about anything, you need to read about it elsewhere. Which is fine, it was just a bit disappointing after reading Drink. And I saw some people complaining about the book being repetitive, but I don't really recall being annoyed by that. And to be fair, reading the book took me a couple of months, so it's possible I just forgot. The book is written in a way where you can actually skip sections, so it makes sense that this would lead to some repetition, so you'd have context. But still, there are some things that I think you should take from this book, and David Nutt's expertise and experience in drug politics and neuropsychopharmacology are once again a highlight of this book. It's not just some rando on Reddit telling you that you're a loser because you don't smoke weed. The book is not that thick, and it covers a lot of things superficially, but here are the things I think you should take away. 1. Weed is not based on science, it's banned because banning weed actually suited someone's political agenda. This book also debunks some myths surrounding weed, including that weed causes schizophrenia, which has been debunked and it's just actually based on this one study. 2. Weed can help humans with a variety of medical conditions, and medical marijuana users and recreational marijuana users are some pretty distinct groups and should not be grouped together. Their patterns of use and their needs are vastly different. And 3, that doesn't mean that weed is this magical solution to all your problems. There are some medical conditions we have evidence that can be alleviated with weed, such as neuropathic pain, cancer-related pain and nausea, and chronic pain management. We also have strong evidence for some types of epilepsy and loss of appetite related to some disorders. But that doesn't mean that cannabis will help you with your problem or that it will help you with anything. It just means that there's a chance. And that's if you live somewhere where you can actually access weed. And this unfortunately means that this path is still inaccessible to a lot of people who could potentially benefit. But who would I recommend this book to? Well, once again, it's really easy to recommend this book to readers of various education levels. The language is clear and accessible even to people without biological or medical background. Which is great because I think it's important to spread this information, and academic gatekeeping actually helps no one. Some parts of the book are super UK-centric, which can be a plus if you live in the UK or if you're interested in that place. But if you're not, it can be really long and draggy. So that's something you should take into account, but as I said, you can always skip those parts, I guess. I didn't, and maybe I should have. The section about medical marijuana is well written, so if you want more information about that, this book is a nice introduction. But it doesn't go in depth in any of these conditions except maybe epilepsy. So if you want to know more about a specific condition, you need to find a different source. And if you're looking for a book about recreational use, this book does not have you covered. And I'm open to recommendations about great books about that, because I want to read about that. And I also want to read more about biology. This was a nice intro, but I wanted something deeper. But if you want to have an argument with someone where you're trying to convince them why state-regulated weed market is actually the way to go, this book will give you a lot of ammunition. So overall, I don't think it's a bad book. It was pretty well received. It has 4.7 stars on Amazon and 4.2 stars on Goodreads. But for me personally, I could have skipped the part about British politics, although you never know where this information can come in handy. And if you want to read about medicinal cannabis, this book is great. I just wish it went a bit deeper and I would have appreciated more biology. I think the downside of this book is mostly that I read the book about alcohol first, and that book was so great I just couldn't stop reading it, and then this one just couldn't keep that standard up. I preached the book about drinking because it did not read like a textbook, and for me, this one, it did. Maybe it's the way the sections are structured or something, but I just had this textbooky feeling. Another downside for me is it's very UK-centric. Which is fine, it's a British author writing about what he knows. It's just something that wasn't for me all that much. And another downside, at least for me, was that I wanted to read a book about recreational use, and this is really focused on medicinal cannabis, which is fine, but I should have prepared for that. I was expecting something more akin to the book about drinking, and this is a vastly different experience. There's nothing wrong with the book, I just don't think it's all that exciting. But if you read the book, let me know in the comments what you think. And that's it for today's video, and thanks for watching. See you next time!